What if I told you that David never felt guilty about what he did with Bathsheba? Well, hey there, and welcome to Redeemer Online. My name's Corey, and it's our mission to help the physically scattered to digitally gather and grow spiritually. Now, this is episode 3 of our series called Canceled: How to Stop Reading the Bible Like That. And the premise of this series is that the Bible isn't for you. It wasn't written for you or about you or to you. And reading it like that is a recipe for all kinds of misinterpretation and misunderstanding. Now, my promise in this series is that if you let go of reading the Bible as though it was for you, you'll begin to discover that there's so much in there for all of us, whether you're religious or a Christian person or not. So, how do you stop reading the Bible like that, like it's for you? Well, it starts with asking different questions. In episode 1, we talked about asking questions of audience and author. In episode 2, we explored questions about the literary context. And today, we're going to talk about the cultural context. Because you see, the authors of Scripture didn't feel the need to explain their culture or historical context because they didn't write with you or me in mind. And because of that, we often miss these historical and cultural clues that would otherwise help us understand the text. For example, let's go back to the story of David and Bathsheba. See, we typically end up reading it as, well, David doing a number of things wrong and then feeling guilty as a result, and in the end, trying to make it right. But what if I told you that David never felt guilty about what he did with Bathsheba? I mean, our 21st century Western mindset often leads us to think in terms of innocent and guilty, right and wrong, good and bad. And look, it's not our fault. I mean, it's how we're raised. A mature person is a person with a strong sense of right and wrong, and a good inner compass, a good moral judgment, a well-formed conscience. One of the things, though, that we don't realize is that in our context, we assume that the authority for right and wrong lies within the individual. Meaning that if I violate my own moral compass, I expect to feel guilty, and then my conscience will bother me, and then I'll have to set out to make it right in some way. But the world David inhabited didn't operate that way. Right and wrong weren't individually set or sought out. David's culture wasn't one of an individual sense of right and wrong, but one of communal honor and shame. And in an honor and shame culture, the authority governing your behavior doesn't lie within you, the individual. It lies with the community. And so it's not about having a good internal compass, living with an individual conscience, but it's about living in light of the communal judgment, a community conscience. And look, the story of David and Bathsheba is a story about David attempting to restore his honor in front of the community. We think what David does in the story is immoral, but that's not what his world thinks, and it's not what David would have thought. Actually, the author tells the story with a focus on honor and shame. And the goal is to show the audience how the dishonorable king destroys his own kingdom. You know what? Let's revisit the story. It opens up with these lines. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army, and they destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Here's the first clue to David acting dishonorably. When kings go off to war, David sent somebody else to go in his place. In that culture, the honorable thing to do was for the king to lead his troops into battle. In fact, it was often what led to him being crowned king in the first place. A man's ability to inspire others and lead them into battle is why they become kings, and that's what kings do. But not David, which is really shame strike one. Then one night, while he was strolling on the balcony of the palace, he sees this beautiful woman bathing. So he sends somebody to go find out about her. And the person returns with the info. And the messenger said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And that should be weird that he phrases it as a question to us, right? And the reason he does is because in an honor-based culture, it would have been shameful for the king to not know something that a lowly messenger knows. And so the messenger poses it as a question in order to help maintain the king's honor, giving him the opportunity to say, "Ah, yes, indeed it is," as though he had the answer the whole time. Then Bathsheba gets brought to the temple and David sleeps with her and he actually impregnates her. And this is the part where we as Western readers think, well, there it is. Adultery, there's a pregnancy as proof. He's wrong, he's guilty, he has acted immorally. But in David's historical and cultural context, that's not actually true. I mean, kings in his day could sleep with whoever they wanted. David himself had 5 or 6 wives at this point and some concubines, I'm pretty sure. And for David to sleep with another man's wife wasn't immediately a problem, so long as that man agreed and was properly compensated. Now, you might read that pretty poorly too, as you should. That's pretty messed up, that a guy can essentially pimp out his wife to the king for a profit. And you'd be right to think it's messed up. It is messed up according to our standards today. And that's why it's so important to understand that the Bible wasn't written for you today. It's this wonderful library of books, each one of them written in a particular time with a unique historical context. And understanding that is really important for understanding what it might mean for you. Okay, back to the story. So David has done something that could potentially result in communal shame, impregnating another man's wife without his consent or compensation. So, what does David do? Well, he goes about trying to restore his honor with the community, which means he calls Bathsheba's husband Uriah to come home from the battle. When Uriah came to him, David asked about how Joab and the army were doing and how the campaign was going. And then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your home and relax." And when Uriah left the palace, the king sent a gift to him. Here's attempt number 1. Compensation. Now, at this point, you might think to yourself, well, how would Uriah know that what the gift was for? How would he even know what was going on? Because we imagine that all this pregnancy stuff is hush-hush, but it's not. The moment David sent somebody to find out about Bathsheba, people would have talked. The moment she got brought to the palace for David to sleep with her, people would have talked. When she left, people would have talked. By the time the messenger arrived at the battle to bring Uriah home, people would have talked. Uriah knew exactly what was going on. And he wasn't about to save David from his own dishonor either. In fact, no, he was about to pile on the shame. Step 1 for him, refuse David's attempt at compensation. But Uriah stayed at the door of the palace with all the servants of his lord. He did not go down to his house. So the servants informed David, "Uriah has not gone down to his house." So David said to Uriah, "Haven't you just arrived from a journey? Why haven't you gone down to your house?" A second conversation. David's second attempt. It's actually to intimidate Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife, because if he does, then the child she's carrying could be considered Uriah's and not David, and an honor would be restored. What we miss here, though, is because we don't understand the culture, is that when David calls him in for a second audience, the cultural connotation was that David was threatening him. But Uriah wasn't having any of it. Step 2, to shame David even more. Uriah replied to David, "The ark in Israel and Judah, they reside in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab and my lord's soldiers are camping in the open fields. Should I go to my house and eat and drink and have marital relations with my wife? As surely as you are alive, I will not do this thing." In this reply, he piles on the shame. He points out that everyone is at war, doing what you should be doing, David. The ark, which is a representation of the presence of your God, is at war. Your people are at war, living in tents. Your commander, Joab, not you, David, and all the soldiers are in an open field at war. How shameful it would be for me to not be with them and instead be at home eating and drinking and sleeping with my wife. In other words, I know exactly what you've been up to. When we were all out there for you, you've been here at home, eating and drinking and sleeping with my wife. David gives it one more try. "Stay here another day. Tomorrow I'll send you back. So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem both that day and the following one. And David summoned him, and he ate and drank with him and got him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his bed with the servants of his Lord. He did not go down to his house, which is basically a public refusal to let David restore his honor. So David played the only card he had left. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Station Uriah in the thick of the battle and then withdraw from him so that he will be cut down and killed," which is exactly what happened. And when Uriah's wife heard that her husband Uriah was dead, she mourned for him. When the time of mourning passed, David had her brought to his palace, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. But what David had done displeased the Lord. When we read that last part about him bringing her in, we assume, oh, David felt guilty and he tried to do the right thing by taking in Bathsheba and marrying her. But that's not actually the case. Actually, David probably didn't feel guilty about it at all. In fact, he got what he wanted. And ultimately, as hard as this is for us to stomach, his honor as king was restored. I mean, how gracious of him to take the wife of a fallen soldier in as his own wife. And what an honor it would be for that woman and for her children to become royal family. Here's the point. David did what kings in his historical moment do. He restored his honor according to his cultural moment in history. Now, the author makes it clear to the audience that despite his cultural sense of honor, David still did something that displeased the Lord. And that's when the prophet Nathan shows up and he sets David straight about it. And he points out that while David might have acted honorably in his culture, he acted dishonorably according to God's call. Because he used his privilege, his position, his power as king to abuse and take from his own people. A long cry from the loving shepherd that he used to be as a kid. And a long cry from who he was supposed to be as a king. And as a result, the whole kingdom crumbles and falls apart. So let's go back to our initial premise. Once you let go of reading the Bible as though it's for you, you begin to see that there's so much there for all of us. And the way to do that, again, is to ask different questions, right? Instead of immediately asking, oh, what does this mean for me? And trying to draw conclusions, you should first ask some historical and contextual questions. You know, what cultural assumptions does the author make that we miss? What is going without being said? What features of that culture would change the way this passage would be understood? Is there anything unique to that culture that could give us some insight? And after we've asked and answered those questions, then we can ask, what does this mean for me? And after examining these questions for the story of David and Bathsheba, it's plain to see that this isn't a story about the dangers of adultery. Remember, the author's intent is to answer the question for his original audience, how did we end up in exile? And examining the historical and cultural context shows us that this story is really about how a dishonorable king destroyed his kingdom. And the takeaway for the people of God in exile is really to wonder about the difference between what's considered honorable in culture and the call of God. And how sometimes those two things, they overlap, but sometimes they're also in stark contrast with one another. The people of God ended up in exile because they and their leaders regularly chose the honor as defined by culture than over the call of God. I mean, that's what David did in this story. Now, what does this story mean for you and for me? That's a great question. I think it's worth wondering, where does God's call overlap with your culture in a good way? Where does it overlap with society's sense of honor and goodness and right and wrong? And where does it deviate? Where are they in conflict? And perhaps more difficultly, how can you tell the difference between the two? Because the call from God on your life isn't necessarily the same as David's call, right? I mean, you're not a king in the ancient Near East during the 10th century before the Common Era. So how do you tell the difference between God's call and your culture's definition of what's good and honorable. And let's be honest, the truth is, it's not always so clear, right? And simply lifting verses out of context to justify our point of view is a recipe for all kinds of misinterpretation and mistreatment. So where does that leave us? Just alone to grope around in the dark and figure out how to do this? Well, I think this is why the gospel writers talked about Jesus as being a light in the darkness. In fact, Jesus himself said, "I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me will never walk in darkness." And he also told his disciples, "As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." In other words, if you want to know how to operate in this world, whether it lines up with your culture and society celebrates it, or when it goes against the grain and society hates you for it, the way you saw me operate in this world, I am sending you to do the same. The way I loved you, so also you should love others. So if you're a follower of Jesus, that's your call from God. Regardless of what your context defines as honorable or good or innocent, as Jesus lived, so also you should live. But Corey, that doesn't settle everything. That doesn't make it all crystal clear. You're right, it doesn't. So when it's not clear, simply ask, what does Jesus' love look like here? And as a community, we'll sort through the rest, but we'll do it with grace and mercy.